Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the February Lunch and Learn of the Warren County Historical Society, Harmon Museum. My name is John Zimkus. I am the Education Director and Historian here, and I know our speaker today quite well. I think you'll enjoy him. There are a lot of things. First off, our speaker is very picky about this, so if you could turn off your cell phones, we would appreciate that. We have a lot of things going on in the weeks to come. As far as Lunch and Learns go, we have next month a very special Lunch and Learn. It's going to be on a different day to accommodate our speakers. It'll be on March 22nd. Wednesday, not the third Wednesday, but the fourth Wednesday. And we'll have two authors. The topic will be our Shaker Legacy, 1805-2023. And we're going to have Christian Goodwillie, the author of the newly published Richard McNamara Frontier Heretic Shaker Apostle. He was a local minister who became one of the driving forces of Western Shakerism, one of the great writers, not only of essays defending Shakerism, but of beautiful hymns sung by the Shakers. And he was the one who defended the Shaker communities throughout the Western, Ohio being a Western state in those days. Also, we will have Carol Meldicott, the author of the Shakers in the Bluegrass, the Kentucky Shakers from Pleasant Hill and also South Union. The two of them will be here. There will be a special, if you can't make it for the Lunch and Learn, they will be speaking again that night. I believe it's at, what, 7:30 is it, Mike? 7:30, and also there'll be book signings. So if you are a local history buff or you are a Shaker buff and you want to get copies of the two latest Shaker books, that is a good one to go to. On Wednesday, April 19th, our speaker will be Jack Blosser, the former head of Fort Ancient, and now the executive director of the Springboro Chamber of Commerce. But he'll be talking about prehistory versus history, how Ohio changed when Euro-Americans came to the area. Our illustrious leader, Michael Coyne, will be our speaker in May. What's new at the museum? Some of you may remember he did an excellent talk last year around the same time, and I expect no less from him this time in May. We have new things not only which came into the museum, but old things we didn't know we had, which are in some cases new to us. So that will be our speaker in May. In June, Susan Anderson Taylor. You may recall she was here last year talking about her grandmother's pen pal just prior to the beginning of World War II, Letters from Paris. She's a teacher at Lebanon High School, and she also was my student teacher at one time. I had her in my classroom. And she'll be talking about the coronation, which took place the month before, and all the different symbolism of that. In July, our speaker will be Tom Calarco. He is in the front table over here. He'll be talking about Orson Murray, 19th century freethinker and Warren County abolitionist. Orson Murray is a fascinating character. We have a portrait of him, which is semi-scary. In the dark Underground Railroad display in the lower level of the Harmon Museum, he sort of looks like Rip Van Winkle after that 20-year nap, but he was a free thinker a good 150 years before we accept the free thinkers of our society. And it'd be a fascinating talk, and I think it's one you will enjoy. We are currently having in our museum Baby It's Cold Outside, a great display of winter garments from the 1800s into the mid-20th century, over 100 years, and they're fantastic. A lot of them are, in fact, our obsession with fur garments. And of course, we show these because of their historical significance, and we do not advocate in any way, shape, or form the killing of animals for wearing just their furs, but you'll be fascinated by what people did wear and thought was fashionable back in those days. We have music at the museum coming up on May 9th. Bobby Strohar, a Celtic harpist, will be here at 7 o'clock that day. On Museum for April will be Lawrence Pitzner, a lutist. Now that's with an L, a lutist, who will be talking about, he'll be playing a lute. He is a professor at Wittenberg University and very much into the Shakespearean time and the music of that time. We also have, speaking of Shakespeare, Shakespeare High Tea on April 27th, tea, hors d'oeuvres, and Shakespearean reading. So that'll be something very different. That'll be 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 27th of April. So we have a lot of interesting things going on. By the way, our meal today is catered by Watkins Catering here in Lebanon. They're on the first block of South Mechanic Street, right in the downtown historic area. And part of the meal you'll be having today is Mary Todd Lincoln's recipe for white cake. So this is, and I see looking at the table, some of you have Mary, and if you look at Mary, she looks like she enjoyed white cake. So enjoy the meal, and in about a half hour or so, our speaker will be introduced. Thank you. Oh, one last thing. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you about this. I don't know how many of you have met Finnegan. Finnegan is the golden retriever, our unofficial greeter, or in many ways our official greeter. There is a children's book called Finnegan and His Magic Tale. And it's all about Finnegan going through the museum. And so not only are there great illustrations, but there is a good look at our museum. And if we're taking pre-orders for this now. It's written by Donna Summers, who is one of our greatest supporters, the curator of the Armstrong Gallery of Flight and also the Mid-Century Modern Room. And she's also a very fine author on her own part and was a Lunch and Learn speaker also last year. In the modern way of publishing, the illustrator lives in Edinburgh, Scotland, if I do believe. Her name is Emma Horn, and although she did not personally visit us, I think she did capture our museum quite well. And so if you would like to make a pre-order of the book, we can do so. They're only going to be $20. The entire proceeds will go to supporting the museum, which we gratefully accept your admission charge here to help us continue to bring great programs like the one hopefully you'll see today. Okay, well, enjoy your meal, and I'll talk to you later.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed your lunch, and I'd like to give a round of applause to Watkins. I think they've done a marvelous job. I'm Michael Coyen. I'm the executive director here at the Warren County Historical Society, and occasionally the staff let me out of the office to come and see you. But it's always an honor for me to introduce to you one of the talented members of our staff. Lunch and Learns have featured the incredible expertise of Jeannie on textiles. I've had the pleasure of sharing my knowledge of art and some of the new things in the collection, and we have that coming up as well. And it's always an honor to introduce John Zimkus. It's an amazing thing because he's everywhere. I was at home snoozing in front of the television, and there he was on the City Show in the Lebanon Channel. I was in the Golden Lamb and heard his dulcet tones talking about the history of the hotel to a group of out-of-towners who had settled quietly. He is a thorough delight to have on staff. He is constantly busy. He is the most voluminous source of historical fact for Warren County that we could possibly have. Truly a treasure. And I am very proud to introduce to you our historian and your speaker, Mr. John Zimkus.
And so much for music at the museum. Well, I want to thank Mike for the very nice introduction. This is a topic I am very, very enthusiastic about. Abe Lincoln's many connections to Warren County, and there really are quite a few. As a former 7th grade teacher, I used to find things to get my students interested in about history, and one of them was that Abe Lincoln is the only bearded president in the United States who was not born in the state of Ohio. He is also the only bearded president not claimed to have visited the Golden Lamp. Now, for many of us, adults and children, naming those 4 Ohio presidents with beards, we know they were president, but we don't know, is that Hayes? Is that Benjamin Harrison? Is that Garfield? They all look like they belong on Smith Brothers cough drop boxes. But we'll talk more about that later. There are many connections, as I mentioned. On Monday, February 11th of 1861, President Lincoln and his family began their 1,904-mile, 12-day journey to Washington. As you can see by this map, they did not go in a straight line. It was meant to be, at least it began as a celebration. And usually there were 3 cars. The first railroad car had journalists in it. The second one had local dignitaries. The third one would have the Lincoln family. Sometimes there was a 4th car. 18 different railway systems were used. He arrived in Cincinnati on his birthday. He was 52. The train arrived at 3 o'clock. Cincinnati at the time was the 7th largest city in the United States. 161,000 people, second only to New Orleans west of the Appalachian Mountains. He said when he saw the crowd, it was more people assembled in winter weather than he had ever seen before. Addressing the crowd, he said, "My friends, I am entirely overwhelmed by the magnificence of this reception which has been given. I will say not for me, but for the President-elect of the United States." Now, he gave several little speeches that day. Although he did not go into Kentucky, he did address the people from Kentucky, which of course was just across the Ohio River. He said, "Fellow citizens of Kentucky, friends, we mean to treat you as near as possible as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison treated you. We mean to leave you alone and no way interfere with your institutions, to abide by all and every compromise of the Constitution." He was basically telling them he had no plans to change the slavery issue at that time. He then went across one of the many bridges over the Miami and Erie Canal. That is the blue line coming down there. This would be Central Avenue, and this will be Eggleston Street today. So if you go in downtown Cincinnati and you're on Central Avenue, you're on top of what was the Miami and Erie Canal. He goes across there, and on the northern side of the canal was where the German neighborhood was. And of course, the canal was referred to as the Rhine River. So to go to that area, you went over the Rhine. And he says to them at that time, "In regards to the Germans and foreigners, I esteem them no better than other people, nor any worse. It is not my nature when I see people borne down by the weight of their shackles and oppressions of tyranny to make their lives more bitter by heaping upon them greater burdens, but rather would do all in my power to raise that yoke than to add anything that would tend to crush them. He then went to the Burnett House. The Burnett House was a 5-story, 340-room hotel located in the northwest corner of 3rd and Vine Streets. It was once called by the London Illustrated Times, or News I should say, the finest hotel in the world. It did last until 1926. The dome you see there was taken down about 30, 40 years after its construction, but it was eventually torn down in 1926. Driving there, he was in a carriage of 6 white horses, 2 more than he had in Indianapolis. John Hay, the president-elect's personal secretary, describing the crowd, says, "The streets along the line were populous as the cities of the Orient. Every window was thronged, every balcony glittered with bright colors and fluttered with handkerchiefs. The sidewalks were packed, every ledge and cornice of the house swarmed with intrepid onlookers." A reporter from the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette said, "A more magnificent ovation has never been witnessed west of the Appalachians. The spontaneous turnout of these at least 100,000 people, comprising all classes, from the rich merchant to the manufacturer, down to the humblest day laborer, to do honor to the man who will be called upon them to save the Union." The next morning, February 13th, the president arose around 6:15, arrived at the Little Miami Railroad Depot on the east part of town, and by 8:30, it's near where Eggleston Street and Sawyer Point is today. And the president did say it was magnificent weather that day. They resumed their journey around 9 o'clock. According to one newspaper report, Lincoln was stiffened in his limbs by handshaking exertion and was beginning to show the symptoms of a cold. The train stopped several times. Milford, Loveland, Morrow, and Corwin. As Lincoln put it, the train made stops whenever the iron horse needed to water itself. Now, it was not recorded what he said on those particular stops, but it was recorded what he said in Painesville, Ohio, and many places in western Pennsylvania and western New York, and he always seemed to be saying the exact same thing. And one of those occasions he did say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have stepped out upon the platform that I may see you, and that you may see me. And in the arrangement, I've got the best of the bargain. The train only stops for a few minutes so that I may have time to make up a few remarks. And the conditions of my voice is such that I could not do more if there was time. I can only say now that I bid you good morning and farewell." Tradition has it that when he stopped in Morrow, and by the train follows pretty much the Little Miami River. And if you've been on the Little Miami bike trail, you're on where the train once was. Now in Morrow, he is said to have, Mary Lincoln is said to have received a bouquet of flowers, white camellias, from the wife of the Little Miami Railway, Mrs. William H. Clements. Lincoln's Warren County kin. Abraham Lincoln's great-grandfather's name was John Lincoln. He was born in New Jersey and moved to Pennsylvania and eventually settled in Rockingham County, Virginia, 120 miles southwest of Washington. And I show you on this slide here where Rockingham County is, where Washington is, and in 1863 where the border between Virginia and West Virginia would be, the green there. John Lincoln and his wife Rebecca had 9 children. Abraham, the president's grandfather and namesake, was the oldest. Abraham and his wife Bathsheba. That's the first time I've ever heard of anybody really outside of the Bible named Bathsheba. But he and his wife Bathsheba moved to Kentucky at the advice of a distant cousin, Daniel Boone. So there is a connection between Abe Lincoln and Daniel Boone in the 1780s. It was there that Abraham, while clearing a field with his 3 sons in 1786, was shot and killed by a Native American. He was only 42. His oldest son, Mordecai, 15, ran to the cabin to find his father's rifle. The next son, Josiah, 13, ran to the nearby settlement about a half a mile away. 8-year-old Thomas, the father of the future president, seemed to be frozen and petrified, standing next to the body of his dead father. As a Native American brave tried to grab the young boy, Mordecai from the cabin fired his father's rifle and killed the native. Lincoln heard that story so much from his father that he said at one time, "That legend is more strongly than any other imprinted upon my mind and memory." Years later, in 1860, after Lincoln had received the Democratic nomination, he wrote his autobiography for John L. Scripps to be published in the Chicago Tribune. But he wrote it in the third person. So rather than saying, "I was born," he said, "he was born." And it was published in the newspaper. He said his grandfather, Abraham, had 4 brothers, Isaac, Jacob, John, and Thomas. So far as known, the descendants of Jacob and John were still in Virginia. But that was not the case. John Lincoln and his wife, another Mary Lincoln, Mary Yarnell Lincoln, were married in Virginia in 1782. And in 1819, he moved to Warren County, Ohio. He had 181 acres north Turtle Creek. You can see on this map, the blue line coming down on the left is State Route 123. The blue line coming down on the right is State Route 48. And the orange line is Kirby Road. He had 180 acres. Now, this particular map came from 1875. At that time, Isaac Lincoln's heirs, that's one of John's sons. He died in 1867. The family still owned 133 acres at that time. Mary died in 1832, and John died 3 years later. He was 79 years old. They're both buried in the Baptist graveyard in what we now call the Pioneer Cemetery in Lebanon. The upper picture on the upper left is the northern part. As you can see here, there was a Baptist cemetery and there was a Methodist cemetery, Methodist Episcopal Cemetery. This was technically the graveyard because, oops, I didn't mean to do that.
Just press the
Exit.
underneath it.
Oh, whoop, that's not what I wanted to show.
There you go.
Okay. I can't touch it. This is technically a graveyard. A graveyard has a church. The Baptist church was located in this general area right over here. You can almost see the indentation of the structure, of the foundation there. That's why there's no markers in the upper left or northwest corner of the cemetery. So the Baptists were in the northern part, the Methodists were in the southern part. There was no fence between the two, although there is about 10 yards of no man's land. And this is an old photograph. This photograph is probably about 90 years old. The markers are still discernible, but not as clear as what you see there of John and Mary Lincoln. The stones fell down sometime in the 1940s and were put in cement, and somehow somebody came between John and Mary Lincoln. So if you go to that marker now, there is a strange marker in between the two. And I'm sure Mary is not too happy about that. Lincoln, in his autobiography for Scripps, did not mention his grandfather's four sisters. There was Sarah, the seventh of the 9 children, 2 years younger than John, the Warren County Lincoln. She was born in 1757, and she married John Franklin Dean around 1777 in Virginia, and like her older brother, eventually moved to Kentucky around 1800. 4 generations of Sarah's family lived in the Bluegrass State. Then in the first third of the 20th century, Sarah Lincoln Dean's great-great-grandson, Fred McKinney Jones, moved from Kentucky to Ohio. It would be his granddaughter who would eventually live a handful of miles from where her great-great-great-uncle John's farm was. And she would make her name for herself in Republican politics in Warren County. And as you may have seen briefly, that's former County Commissioner Pat Arnold South. She is the second cousin 4 times removed from President Abraham Lincoln. And she was Warren County's very first female county commissioner, serving from 1992 to 2016. Okay. Tom Corwin and Abe Lincoln. It's such a shame that Tom Corwin is not as well known as he is. He was a contemporary of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, and he was considered the finest orator in the nation at one time, the king of the stump speech. What a fantastic resume he had. His father was Matthias Corwin. His uncle was Ichabod, one of the 4 founders of Lebanon. He was born in Kentucky, came here to the Ohio Territory when he was only 4 years old, became prosecuting attorney, became a member of the Ohio legislature, became a United States congressman, became the governor of Ohio, became a United States senator, became Secretary Treasury of the United States, and was appointed by Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. Minister to Mexico. He also was one time considered a possible presidential candidate. Looking at the audience I see before me, many of you probably remember the TV series called Profiles in Courage, based on JFK's book. It lasted only 1 year, 1964 to 1965. Some of the stories came right out of the president's book. Some were added, and the president had approved the ones that were added before he was assassinated. But the very last episode was on May 9th of 1965, and it was the story of Tom Corwin, how he could have been president of the United States had he not spoken out against the Mexican War. Really, and it really was quite extraordinary. There are a number of similarities between him and Abraham Lincoln. Both were born in Kentucky. Both were raised in nearby states. Lincoln, of course, in Indiana, and Corwin in Ohio. Both very little formal education, but still avid readers, reading everything they could get their hands on. Both were lawyers. Both were well known for humorous storytellers. Both opposed the Mexican War in Congress. Lincoln, in his one and only term in the U.S. Congress, is said to have been influenced by Corwin's most famous speech against the Mexican War on the floor of the United States Senate. And both of them died in 1865. Both were Whigs, both were followers of Henry Clay. Both knew the relationship between the horse laugh and horse sense. They were not telling stories just to be funny. They were making a point. They were making a point to help win over to what they were trying to propose. Both very well known for that. Both were rather self-effacing, making fun of their looks. Lincoln, he's 6'4". He's a good, I'm reading a book, the story of a book by Ron Chernow. Lincoln meeting Grant for the first time. Lincoln was 8 inches taller than Grant. And Lincoln stood out in the crowd. He also was perceived as being awkward. And in some cases, he was considered to be ugly. One time, he was accused of being two-faced on an issue. And he said, "If I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one?" Now, with Corwin, he made fun of his swarthy, dark complexion. Some of it is somewhat politically incorrect today. He was referred to as the blackest white man in America. He was called Black Tom. There was one story, he was giving a speech and someone opened up an umbrella to shield him and he said, "I don't think the sun will spoil my complexion." There was another time, according to the Harper's Magazine in 1867, 2 years after he died, Corwin was introduced to the British engineer, Sir Morton Peto. He's the one who designed the new House of Parliament. And Peto, meeting him, actually asked him if his tribe was at peace with the whites. Now, when I was working on my master's some 45 plus years ago, my professor, Dr. Carl Becker, who was the head of the history department at Wright State University, mentioned in one of his, the class was local history, and he mentioned that the Scientific American on September 11th of 1845 had the story that Tom Corwin, this is between being a U.S. Senator and between governor and being U.S. Senator, was arrested because he was mistaken to be a runaway slave. Now, for 40 plus years, I have searched trying to find that particular Scientific American. I did not find it, but I still found the article yesterday. It was appeared in the Voice of Industry from Pittsburgh, Massachusetts, September 4th, 1845, a good 7 days before the Scientific American. The newspaper was, in fact, a labor newspaper. And eventually became the voice of the Women's Union of Textile Workers in Boston. But the article said, Cincinnati Herald on the 15th instant, which probably in this case probably meant August, says that ex-Governor Corwin, who had a very swarthy complexion, while traveling about 15 miles from this place, was seized by a party of armed men who rushed out of the woods and swearing that he was a colored man, they tied and bore him to jail as a runaway slave. And by the way, yes, I still have my college notes from 1976. Also, like Corwin and Lincoln, they both were depressed many times. Corwin, as you heard, such a fantastic resume, but he also often felt he was a failure in life. And he actually blamed it on his sense of humor. When he heard a young politician, this is one of the most popular quotes about Corwin, and I have him. There are some people who said he told it to young James A. Garfield, future president, and he did know Garfield very well, and some other politicians, but most likely it was Don Pratt, P-R-A-T-T, or Piatt, P-I-A-T-T, who lived north of Dayton. And when he saw the man telling a joke, he said, "Don't do it, my boy. You should remember the crowd always looks up to the ringmaster and down on the clown. The clown is the more clever fellow of the two, but he is despised. If you would succeed in life, you must be solemn as an ass. All great monuments on earth are built over solemn asses." So even in telling him not to be funny, he was funny. In 1859, Judge A.G.W. Carter, along with Corwin, met Lincoln once again in the Burnett House. This is most likely after Lincoln had just spoken in Dayton in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse. And they met him, and they were talking about what a funny individual he is, how he uses that humor so greatly. He had spoken to a crowd standing on the balcony of a store on 5th Street, Mr. Kenny's store. They saw Corwin and they asked Corwin to speak, and he denied, "I did not want to speak." But Corwin, after seeing him, did remark that he would yield the palm of storytelling to Mr. Lincoln. Hand over the crown, if you will. So he did consider him the better of the two. But there is some debate to that. Robert Bull was a politician and a doctor, a close friend of Lincoln in Illinois, and a loyal political supporter from the early days. He wrote that he did visit Lincoln at the White House shortly after the inauguration. And he said he would walk up and down through the room with his hands on his side, laughing at a joke he was telling or what he was about to tell you. I remember one story he told at that occasion, and he began by saying, "I must tell you Tom Corwin's latest." Now, it seems this was early March of 1861. Corwin had been to Alexandria, Virginia, and he met a man who said he knew George Washington. And now, ever since Corwin was a little boy, his father, Matthias, had always told him that George Washington never lied. He was a faultless person. The father of our country was one you should follow in his footsteps. Then Corwin said, "Well, when I heard that George Washington was addicted to the vices and infirmities of man, I felt so relieved I could shout for joy." So George was a human being, and Tom thought that was fantastic. Carl Sandburg, in his monumental work in the 1940s and late 30s, did say Tom Corwin was the best written storyteller in Washington on his book on Lincoln. William Schuler, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Mr. Schuler was a journalist, politician, and during the Civil War, Adjutant General of Massachusetts. And he knew Tom Corwin quite well. And he did say, Corwin's stories were differently told and were in themselves different from those of President Lincoln. Corwin appeared to make up his on the occasion as it presented itself. Lincoln appeared to have his stories ready at hand, all sorts of them, to be used when he wanted them. In the 1860 Republican Convention, Corwin was obligated to nominate John McLean from Warren County for President of the United States. McLean founded the Western Star newspaper here in Lebanon in 1807. He went on to become a U.S. Congressman, the member of the Ohio Supreme Court, Postmaster General of the United States, and then for 31 years, a member of the United States Supreme Court. At the first Republican convention in 1856, he became second to John C. Fremont. It is now 4 years later, and his name is put in nomination. On the third ballot, however, Corwin and another man from the Ohio delegation changed their vote, and they voted for Lincoln. And that did give Lincoln the nomination. During the presidential campaign, Corwin did travel tirelessly over a 10-state area campaigning for him. In late 1860 and early 1861, Corwin was part of a special 33-member House committee, and their job was to try and stop a civil war. The way they did it was by making the statement that slavery could not be stopped by the federal government, and it would not be stopped by the federal government, and this would be a amendment to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. Now, many people, it's unfortunate today that we look at historic events with a 21st century mindset. And we think, I'll tear down that statue, he owned slaves. Take that name off that building, he owned slaves, or that sort of thing. We don't appreciate, David McCullough, one of the things I really appreciate by that great past historian, McCullough said, you have to look what pressures were on them. What were their concerns? What were they doing? It is true, Tom Corwin was the head of this committee. It was true, this committee would save slavery. But why? Because they wanted to save the Union. They didn't want the United States to end. They didn't want a civil war to begin. That was their motive. And without taking that into consideration, there were newspaper articles in the Cincinnati Enquirer a few years ago. How terrible is Ohio Senator and Ohio Representative Tom Corwin was wanting to save slavery. You can't take it out and look at it in a microscope. You can't look at it at a vacuum. You must look at what was going on. It of course, did not prove to do much because even before the committee had a chance to meet, South Carolina already left the Union, and shortly followed by Florida and Mississippi. On January 14th, when that committee was about to publicize its suggestion, Corwin wrote a letter to President-elect Lincoln. And on the outside of the envelope, it said, Lincoln's eyes only. And in that letter, he talked about that committee. He said, if the states are no more harmonious in their feelings and opinions than these 33 representatives, men, then appalling as the idea is, we must dissolve, and a long and bloody civil war must follow. I cannot comprehend the madness of the time. Southern men are theoretically crazy. Extreme Northern men are practical fools. The latter are really guilty as much as the former. Treason is in the air around us everywhere. It goes by the name of patriotism. Men in Congress boldly avow it, and the public officers are full of acknowledged secessionists. God alone, I fear, can help us. 4 or 5 states are gone, others are driving before the gale. I have looked at this hard picture till I have been able to gaze at it in perfect calmness. And then he said, slightly prophetically, I think if you live, you may take the oath. So he was off by about 5 years. In those first weeks, Lincoln invited Corwin to talk to him about who should we send to Mexico to be the title is U.S. Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary. That's a mouthful. I had to practice that. Basically, the U.S. minister. Now, the minister is different from an ambassador. An ambassador is a slightly higher position. He has an embassy. A minister has a mission, the U.S. mission. Finally, after meeting with Lincoln, they decided that Corwin should be that U.S. minister. He did not speak Spanish, but he was still famous for his anti-Mexican War speech, the one that the Profiles in Courage had emphasized. And so it was considered by Seward, the Secretary of State, as the most important diplomatic post in the United States. Important because they did not want, the war technically hadn't begun yet. They did not want supplies, however, to go to Mexico over the Rio Grande into Texas. The beginning of a blockade of the southern ports was beginning. Corwin's sails out of New York City on April 11th, 1861. The following day, Fort Sumter is attacked and the Civil War is a hot war. It has begun. Now, Corwin was there for over 2 years. He is said to think of his position as being not the most successful. But a Confederate general named Hamilton B. in 1862 did write the President of the Confederacy, "Through the influence of Mr. Corwin, the tone of the Juarez Mexican government has been hostile to our cause. It has, his dictations, various measures have been initiated, calculated to annoy and injure us. They have finally decreed martial law on the frontier and forbid the export or import of any article whatever from Texas." Lincoln would serve as president one more time. On April 19th, 1865, he was one of the 22 official pallbearers at Lincoln's Washington, D.C. funeral. There were 6 from the Senate, there were 6 from the House, 3 from the Navy, including 1 Marine colonel, 3 from the Army, including Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, and 3 civilians, including Tom Corwin. Franklin was the birthplace of Robert C. Schenck. Lincoln, when he was in his one term in Congress, and when he got there in 1846, was elected, he did know that Schenck was one of the few congressmen he recognized as being industrious and competent. Schenck, as I mentioned, was born in Franklin in 1809, same year that Lincoln was born. His father was William C. Schenck, the founder of Franklin. He graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, in their second graduation class of college students, and that was in 1827. He studied law under Tom Corwin and had opened a practice in Dayton. First elected to Congress in 1842, he was elected 3 times, and then in 1851, he was named the U.S. Minister to Brazil. On September 17th of 1859, he is the man who introduced Lincoln in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Dayton. A famous speech of Lincoln's as far as this part of Ohio goes. He was also at that time said to be the first person ever to suggest that Lincoln should be the presidential nominee in the future. When Lincoln was in fact elected, Schenck went to Springfield, Illinois to visit the president-elect at his home. The New York Herald predicted that Schenck would be awarded the Secretary of the Interior Department. And that did not happen. He did not receive any department head. Lincoln did, however, appoint him a brigadier general. And although he was a civilian officer, and many of them weren't worth their salt as far as military service goes, he did fight quite well in the First and Second Battle of Bull Run. In the second battle, he was wounded in the right wrist. He was promoted to Major General. He stayed in the military but did not have a combat position after that. In 1862, he was running for Congress again against Clement Vallandigham, who we will talk about in a moment or two, the famous Copperhead. The congressman from the North who thought the South had a right to leave the Union. And it was only after Warren County, even back in 1862, a very Republican county, was put in the Dayton 3rd District that he was defeated. Vallandigham was defeated and Schenck was elected. He was still in the military, however. And when Lincoln was on his way to give his famous Gettysburg Address, his train did stop in Baltimore, where Schenck was in charge of the Department of Baltimore. Baltimore, Maryland was a border state. It had slaves, but it had not seceded. And Schenck and his staff boarded the train. On the parade to the speaker's platform in Gettysburg, Schenck rode outside of Lincoln's carriage. This is the only photograph known to have been taken at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln is about to sit down. It was such a short speech, the cameraman thought he had more time. But somewhere on that platform was Robert C. Schenck. He did sit on that platform today. After Lincoln's assassination, Schenck was one of the congressional delegations. There was a 1,700-mile trip back to Springfield, Illinois. Not the same route as Lincoln's trip to Washington in 1861, but almost as long. Schenck was at 11 of those 12 funerals in that long trip back to Springfield. He would be elected back to Congress and eventually become the U.S. Minister to Great Britain. And it was in Great Britain that he wrote a book on how to play poker, which was published in the United Kingdom. Copperhead Clement Vallandigham, Lincoln's northern nemesis. Martin Gottlieb was our speaker of last year. He wrote the book called Lincoln's Northern Nemesis, and I really liked it. He applies it to Vallandigham, so I'm admitting to you I stole the name of the book for this section. Vallandigham, as we've already mentioned, was a congressman at one time. He was a Copperhead, a peace Democrat, he called himself. He was the leader. If you can Google Copperhead on the computer, and his name will definitely come up. He was defeated, as I mentioned, by Schenck. He still spoke out against Lincoln on May 1st, 1863 in Mount Vernon, Ohio, east of Columbus, excuse me. And he gave a speech, and he called him King Lincoln, and he was one of the causes of the Civil War. 4 days later, in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. on May 5th, soldiers broke into his home in Dayton, Ohio. And they arrested him for giving verbal aid to the enemy, violating General Order number 38. It was all done without Lincoln's knowledge. They took him to Cincinnati, where he's put on military trial, which was somewhat unconstitutional since he was not a military man. He was going to be sentenced to confinement for 2 years or until the duration of the war. Lincoln was furious about this. He did not want to make him a martyr. Although he did say, "I must shoot the simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair on the wily agitator who induces him to desert." So rather than put him in prison, he had him expelled to the South. But the South didn't know what to do with him. He went from Wilmington, North Carolina to Bermuda to Nova Scotia to Windsor, Ontario, nominated for governor when he wasn't allowed in the state. And when John Bruff, Cincinnati publisher of the Cincinnati Enquirer, won the election for governor, Lincoln did say, "Glory to God in the highest. Ohio has saved the Union." After the war, he's allowed legally back into Ohio. On Christmas Eve of 1870, he's defending a man accused of murder on the back room of a saloon in Hamilton, Ohio. A dead man, he was killed. The accused was a minor thug and criminal who happened to be a Democrat. The dead man was a minor thug and criminal who happened to be a Republican. They both had powerful friends. They moved the trial to Lebanon for a change of venue, and Vallandigham is one of a half a dozen defense attorneys. I'm kind of proud of that one picture. I took an old picture of the Golden Lamb and I took out one floor. It was only 3 floors at that time, so I mean, it looks pretty good. You probably wouldn't know unless I told you. So. That gentleman is A.G. McBurney. Those of you who live in town may be familiar with Bernie Hill. He is not a guitar player for ZZ Top. But he was the former lieutenant governor of the state, and he is also one of the defense attorneys. Now, during the course of the trial, which is 6 months later, Vallandigham is staying on the 2nd floor. There's a small dining room, as you can see in that one side there. It's called the Vallandigham room. Excuse me. He was convinced he could prove that the dead man actually shot himself while having a scuffle. And so he and 2 other counsels go to McBurney's property, which is just up the hill. We're talking about a quarter of a mile or less up Broadway Hill. They fired into a piece of cloth to see if it didn't leave powder burns. There was a bullet or 2 left in the gun. They come back to the Golden Lamb, of the Lebanon House, as it was then called. They get a package there, and it's a package for Vallandigham. It has a .32 revolver in it, and he's supposed to use that gun in the courtroom demonstration. He goes up to his room, and in front of only McBurney, he starts to reenact what was going to happen in the trial. In his excitement, he picked up the wrong gun. And showing how the dead man could have shot himself, he shot himself. Members of the jury who were spending the night there come running into the room. 2 local doctors are called. Dr. Selden S. Scoville, the father of Lodora Scoville Owens, the last owner of the Glendower Mansion, and Dr. Isaac Lincoln Drake, the 2nd cousin of President Abraham Lincoln, the grandson of John Lincoln of Warren County. Now, this is an ad from 1872 from a newspaper called the Lebanon Patriot, and it has the two doctors having little ads very close to each other. And on this side over here, you see the Lebanon House, the Golden Lamb, and 2 blocks to the north is the home and office of Dr. Isaac Lincoln Drake. Now, they both tell him they think the wound is going to be fatal. Shortly before 10 o'clock the following day, Vallandigham does die. All night long, although he was a Republican and many of the Democrat, and many of the town people at first didn't like him, he had won them over by his charm. And the streets were filled with hundreds of people all night long, trying to see outside his window to see what was going on. They actually had to place a guard at the bottom of the steps of the Golden Lamb so people would not come up to to bother him in his room. His funeral in Dayton on the 20th of June was huge, 131 carriages. It is said it took a half hour for all of them to pass by the Warren County Courthouse, where Lincoln spoke in 1859. Thousands of people came to his to view the funeral. That is his impressive marker at Woodland Cemetery in Dayton, the same cemetery the Wright brothers are buried in, and Paul Laurence Dunbar. On display here in the book here, by the way, I failed to mention when Corwin was named Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary, that is the actual document signed by Abraham Lincoln and Tom Corwin and William Seward, the Secretary of State, naming Corwin the U.S. Minister. That is the book. This is the book we have, Drake's account book. Now, usually he just wrote down who he was dealing with, what happened on June 16th, 1871. He has the patient's name, procedure. Right next to it, he had DR 25, DR meaning debit or debt. $25, about $475 today. He does say the amount was paid over 2 months later on August 21st, 1871. And then he writes, I don't know what, right here, misquoting the Bible, the memory of the wicked shall rot. This is Proverbs 10:7. King James Version, the memory of the just is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. And then below that, he writes, the above service was rendered this distinguished individual during his last hours after being shot in the abdomen by his own hand, by mistake, a mistake no doubt. But while rehearsing a farce to save a murderer, he had defended in court. Acting a lie, he grabbed the wrong pistol, the loaded one. The iconic Lincoln bed in the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln, and we have her shawl right over there. It was believed to have been made around 1867 or thereabouts. After Lincoln's assassination, she became very, very destitute financially, and she sold off a lot of her clothes that she had accumulated. And it is believed that that shawl was sold off. It was given to us years ago by Mary L. Cook, the doctor, physician, from the Waynesville area for decades and decades. Also, while we're talking about what we have over there, the bed covering was made by Rachel Lincoln Drake, the mother of Dr. Isaac Lincoln Drake. It was one of the last things she created in the 1840s before her death around 1845. So these are some of the things, artifacts we have at our museum concerning Mr. Lincoln and his connections. The Mary Todd Lincoln did buy the Lincoln bed. Oh, Jacqueline Kennedy did refer to the bed once as, when you look at this grate, it looks like a cathedral. Rosewood, 10 feet tall, grapes and grapevines and birds on the ornamentation. It was bought, one of the 10-piece items bought by Mary Todd Lincoln in 1861. Apparently the White House did not have good furniture, but also Mary Todd Lincoln was famous for spending a lot of money on clothes and furniture and what have you. Lincoln never actually slept in the Lincoln bed, although his 11-year-old son, Willie, died in that bed on February 20th, 1862. This is a fantastic life-size diorama at the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. They have, close to a dozen of these wax figures, and they look so real. There was one of them, when I was there, I was setting off alarms because they had a young Lincoln reading a book. And you could see the hairs on the back of his wrist on this wax figure. And I wanted to see what he was reading. And every time I put my head around the corner, a little buzzer went off. But that you can see in this slide here that the bed is the same sort of one we're talking about. Now, it originally was in what was called the Prince of Wales room, which is now the presidential dining room. And that is in the upper left corner there, is that tan. It was the official bed of the Hayes family, the Wilson family, and the Coolidge family. It was briefly in storage in 1909. And then it was Harry Truman who put it in what is now the Lincoln bedroom on the lower right. Many a famous person spent the night there. Adlai Stevens, two-time presidential nominee from the Democratic Party, was a guest of Harry Truman there, spent the night there. Although he was a Democrat, he was a devoted Lincoln fan. He did not deem himself worthy to even think of sleeping on a bed that Lincoln might have slept on. So he curled up on the couch, not knowing that Lincoln never used the bed, but did use the couch. Former Miss America Phyllis George and her then husband, Kentucky Governor John Y. Brown Jr., spent the night there during the Carter administration. This was in 1980, or close to it. 9 months later, they had a son who they named Lincoln. That is Lincoln Tyler George Brown, 3 years old, welcoming his sister, Pamela Ashley Brown, in 1883. So, 1983, thank you very much. Yeah. Jimmy Carter's daughter had friends over for sleepovers. They stayed up to find Lincoln's ghost. They even used a Ouija board to try and contact him, but they could not get in contact with Lincoln. In a different room during World War II, Prime Minister Winston Churchill spent the night in the Lincoln bedroom. He is said not to have liked the bed at all. And there is a story told that he liked to sleep naked, and he had taken a bath, and he's walking across the hall in the White House totally naked, and Lincoln's ghost appears, and he says, "Good evening, Mr. President, you have me at a disadvantage." Now, in researching this, I found out something very curious. In the early 1980s, DC Comics took part of that story. Now, DC Comics, the people behind Batman, Superman, and what have you, in 1981 came up with the All-Star Squadron. This is complicated, but this was what was referred to as a retroactive continuity comic, or retcon. They had characters in the 1940s. In 1981, they make new characters They have it all take place in the 1940s, a combination of characters which already existed in the 1940s and the new characters they were creating. And it all takes place during World War II and what have you. So we have, this guy's name is Atom, A-T-O-M, and that is, the lady with the mask is Liberty Bell. And according to the comic, Adam says, but he's not here. Sir, no. And then all of a sudden FDR says, wait, isn't that running bathwater I hear? And then Churchill comes out and says, hey, I thought I heard someone out there. Oh, pardon me, Mr. Prime Minister, we didn't mean to. We can return until you're finished with your bath. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to conceal from the President of the United States. Now, what is on your mind, Mr. President? And that's what the comic looked like. Now, Maureen Reagan, the daughter of Ronald Reagan, claims to have seen Lincoln's ghost multiple times. Ronald Reagan's dog, Rex, who is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, would bark outside the bedroom door, the Lincoln bedroom, but he would never go into it. During the Clinton administrations, as some of you may recall, 800 guests during the 8 years spent the night in the Lincoln bedroom, many of them donators to the Democratic National Committee, everybody from Billy Graham to Jane Fonda, and from Lee Iacocca, the head of Chrysler, to Barbara Streisand. Now, if you are not invited to the White House, you can still somewhat have the experience of sleeping in the Lincoln bed by visiting the Golden Lamb. The Golden Lamb has its Charles Dickens room on the second floor. The headboards are extremely similar. They're both rosewood. They're both 10 feet tall. They're large ovals with a large oval with two smaller ovals. The ornamentation is slightly different, but there are definitely similarities. And there's a whole different slew of ghosts who may visit you here. Now, I mentioned when we first began, you can't tell an Ohio president with a beard from the Smith brothers on the cough drop boxes. I have a prize for somebody who will tell me which two are the Smith brothers. Nobody, yes. A and C, sorry. Yes. So raise your hand. I really got a prize. I got to give it to somebody. Yes. A and E.
B and F.
Tom?
B and F.
A and
No,
F.
B and F.
B and F?
E and F.
E,
Is that correct?
E and F? No. This is harder than I thought. Yes. A and E. No. Oh, gee, I'm not going to be, yeah. C and E? C and D. You are correct. You are absolutely correct. Now, the Andrew Smith is the one with the beard, C. His brother William is the D without the mustache. Their father, in 1847, James Smith, started the company. After his death in 1866, the brothers continued it. To tell themselves from the other different cough drops at the time, they put their faces on the boxes. And then in 1877, they trademarked that. And under William's face, That would be this one right here. They had the word trade, and under Andrew's face, they had the word Mark. And people at that time used to joke, maybe someone thought it was real, that their names were Trade Smith and Mark Smith. Now, what I owe you is the Lincoln Memorial Cent, minted from 1959, coming out on Lincoln's 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, and they stopped minting it in 2008. Noteworthy because it has Lincoln on both sides of the coin. Not only is it his face there, but also he is in the middle of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, we had such a rough time identifying the Smith brothers. We may never leave here. I've got 20 times as much prize money right here. All Lincoln Memorial pennies for anybody who can identify the 4 Ohio presidents. Now, by identify, I want their names. That's why we'll be here until tomorrow. Well, I'll tell you what, so we can all leave here, can somebody name their names without necessarily identifying them? Grant, Garfield, Taft had a mustache, no beard. Abe's not from Ohio. Garfield, we've got Grant and Garfield. Now, one of them, his father said, "Aren't you going to shave? You're very blank, son." You're very Harrison. Okay, and I know you all know the other one, but apparently you're pretty hazy about it. Okay, so I guess I get to keep these 20 pennies. And so we have James A. Garfield, we have U.S. Grant, we have Rutherford B. Hayes, and we have Benjamin Harrison, and of course we have William Smith, and we have Andrew Smith. And thank you very much for listening to me today. Does anybody have any questions I can answer for you? Well, if not, enjoy your visit to the museum and hope to see you next week, or next month rather. Take care now.